The Winchester rifle pressed cold against Georgia Parker's shoulder as she aimed at the empty whiskey bottle perched on the fence post, her finger steady on the trigger, despite the fury coursing through her veins like wildfire. She squeezed. The bottle exploded into glittering shards under the harsh Idaho sun, and still the rage inside her chest refused to quiet. It had been 3 days since she had arrived in Snake River, 3 days since her father's funeral, 3 days since she learned that the ranch she had grown up hearing stories about was now hers, and 3 days since the banker had informed her that, unless she could make the operation profitable within 6 months, the bank would foreclose on everything her father had built. The year was 1882, and women were not supposed to inherit ranches, run businesses, or have opinions that mattered. Georgia had all three, along with a temper that could rival the worst summer storm that rolled across the Idaho plains. She reloaded the rifle with practiced efficiency, her movements sharp and controlled in a way her emotions never quite managed to be. Another bottle, another explosion of glass. The satisfying crack of destruction did nothing to ease the knot of frustration that had taken up permanent residence in her stomach. "You keep shooting like that, you will run out of bottles before sunset," a voice called from behind her, smooth and unhurried as honey dripping from a spoon. Georgia spun around, rifle still raised, her green eyes flashing with immediate suspicion. A man stood 20 feet away, his hands held loosely at his sides in a gesture of peace. He was tall, with sun-darkened skin and sandy brown hair that curled slightly at the edges beneath a worn Stetson. His clothes marked him as a working cowboy, nothing fancy, just sturdy denim and a faded shirt that had seen better days. But it was his eyes that caught her attention, blue as the sky above them and filled with a patience that seemed utterly out of place in the hard landscape of the American West. "This is private property," Georgia said, her voice sharp as broken glass. "You are trespassing." "I know," the man said, his mouth quirking up at one corner. "I am Ethan Brooks. I worked for your father for the past 2 years. He hired me on after I drifted down from Montana. I have been staying in the bunkhouse with the other hands." Georgia lowered the rifle slightly, but did not put it down. She had heard the names of her father's employees read out by the lawyer, but faces and names had blurred together in the fog of grief and overwhelming responsibility. "My father is dead." "I know," Ethan said again, and this time there was genuine sorrow in his voice. "He was a good man, fair, honest, the kind of boss who worked alongside his men instead of just giving orders from a distance." Something in Georgia's chest tightened painfully. She had not seen her father in 5 years, not since her mother had taken her east to Boston when she was 15, insisting that Georgia needed proper education and refinement. Her mother had died 2 years ago, and Georgia had been working as a teacher in a small school, trying to make her own way in the world. The telegram about her father's sudden death from a heart attack had arrived like a thunderbolt, appending everything she thought she knew about her future. "If you worked for him, then you know the ranch is in trouble," Georgia said, deciding that bluntness was better than dancing around the truth. "The banker made it very clear that my father had been struggling. Bad winters, lost cattle, falling prices. I am supposed to turn this around in 6 months or lose everything." Ethan took a few steps closer, moving slowly as if approaching a skittish horse. "Your father never mentioned he had a daughter. I think he kept that information close to his heart, something private and precious. But he talked about Boston sometimes, about someone he missed. I think that was you." The words hit harder than Georgia expected. She turned away, blinking rapidly against the sudden burning in her eyes. She would not cry. She had cried enough already. alone in the big ranch house that smelled of tobacco and leather and memories of a father she had barely known as an adult. "I do not need sympathy," she said, her voice coming out harder than she intended. "I need help. The other ranch hands are good men, I suppose, but they look at me like I am a child playing dress-up in her father's clothes. They do not take me seriously." "That is because they do not know you yet," Ethan said reasonably. "Give them time." Georgia whirled back around, and the fury that had been simmering all day suddenly boiled over. "I do not have time. I have 6 months to prove I can run this ranch. 6 months to turn a profit. 6 months to show every man in this territory that I am not some weak Eastern woman who will crumble at the first sign of hardship. And do you know what the worst part is? I do not even know if I can do it. I know how to teach children their letters and numbers. I know how to pour tea and make polite conversation. I do not know anything about cattle or horses or what it takes to run a ranch in this God-forsaken wilderness." She was breathing hard now, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. The rifle hung forgotten from one hand. "I have a terrible temper," she said, forcing the words out like a confession. "I always have. My mother spent years trying to train it out of me, trying to make me into a proper lady who smiled and nodded and never raised her voice. But it did not work. I am angry all the time. Angry at the world. Angry at myself. Angry at my father for dying before I could tell him I forgive him for letting me go without a fight. Angry at my mother for taking me away. Angry at every single person in this town who looks at me and sees nothing but a woman who does not belong." The silence that followed her outburst was broken only by the whisper of wind through the dry grass and the distant lowing of cattle. Georgia felt exposed, raw, like she had just stripped off a layer of skin and revealed everything ugly and true underneath. Ethan looked at her for a long moment, those patient blue eyes taking in every detail of her flushed face and trembling hands. Then, slowly, his mouth curved into a grin that transformed his entire face from merely handsome to something that made Georgia's heart skip in a way she did not want to examine too closely. "Then our life will never be boring," he said simply. Georgia stared at him. "What?" "You heard me," Ethan said, his grin widening. "I like a woman with fire in her. The world has enough quiet, obedient people. And if you are worried about learning how to run this ranch, well, that is something I can help with. I have been working cattle since I was 12 years old. I know this land, I know the business, and I know what your father was planning before he died." "Why would you help me?" Georgia asked suspiciously. "What do you get out of it?" Ethan shrugged. "Honest work, fair pay, and the satisfaction of proving all those men in town wrong about you." "That seems like a good enough reason to me." Georgia wanted to argue, wanted to find the catch, the hidden motive, the inevitable betrayal that her cynical Eastern education had taught her to expect. But she was also practical enough to know that she genuinely did need help, and Ethan Brooks seemed like the best option currently available. "Fine," she said curtly. "You can help. But understand this. I am in charge. This is my ranch, my responsibility, my risk. I will listen to your advice, but I make the final decisions." "Yes, madam," Ethan said, and there was no mockery in his voice, only respect. Georgia nodded once, sharp and decisive. "Good. Then let us start with you telling me exactly what state this ranch is in and what we need to do to save it." They walked back toward the ranch house together, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the dusty ground. Ethan talked as they walked, his voice steady and informative, laying out the realities of the situation with neither false optimism nor crushing pessimism. The ranch had 200 head of cattle, down from 300 the previous year. The winter had been harsh, and they had lost animals to cold, disease, and predators. The remaining hands were good workers, but demoralized by the string of bad luck and uncertain about their future now that their employer was gone. Georgia listened intently, her sharp mind cataloging every detail. The ranch house came into view, a solid structure of wood and stone that her father had built with his own hands decades ago. It was not fancy, but it was sturdy, built to withstand the harsh Idaho winters and the scorching summers. "The biggest problem is the water," Ethan continued. "The creek that runs through our grazing land is drying up earlier each summer. We need to dig a proper well or find a way to divert more water from the Snake River. Without reliable water, we cannot sustain the herd through the hot months." "How much would a well cost?" Georgia asked. "More than you probably have in ready cash," Ethan admitted. "But there might be another way. There is a spring in the hills to the north, on land that borders the Clearwater territory. If we could secure access to that spring, we could run a channel down to our grazing land. It would take labor and materials, but it would be cheaper than a well and more reliable." "Who owns the land with the spring?" Georgia asked. Ethan hesitated. "That is complicated. It is technically unclaimed territory, but the Clearwater Ranch has been using it for years. Marcus Clearwater considers it his, even if he does not have legal title to it." Georgia felt her temper flare again. "So this Marcus Clearwater is just claiming public land as his own." "That is how things work out here," Ethan said calmly. "The law is one thing, but practical reality is another. Clearwater has the men and the guns to back up his claims. Your father tried to negotiate with him a few years ago, but Clearwater refused. He does not like competition, and he especially does not like the idea of smaller ranchers succeeding." "Then I will make him like it," Georgia said flatly. Ethan stopped walking and turned to look at her. "That temper of yours is going to get you into trouble if you are not careful. Marcus Clearwater is not a man to cross lightly." "I am not interested in crossing him lightly," Georgia said. "I am interested in getting access to water that my cattle need to survive. If he has no legal claim to that land, then I have just as much right to it as he does." "You are not wrong," Ethan said slowly. "But being right and being dead are not mutually exclusive out here." Georgia met his eyes squarely. "Then I suppose you will have to make sure I do not get killed." Something shifted in Ethan's expression, something warm and almost amused. "I suppose I will." They resumed walking, and Georgia found herself oddly aware of Ethan's presence beside her. The easy way he moved, the competence that radiated from him like heat from a stove. She had known him for less than an hour, but already she felt like he understood something fundamental about her that most people missed. He was not intimidated by her anger, not put off by her bluntness, not trying to change her into something more palatable. Over the next few weeks, Georgia threw herself into learning everything she could about running the ranch. She rose before dawn and worked until well after sunset, pushing herself to exhaustion each day. Ethan was always there, patient and steady, teaching her how to read the health of cattle, how to spot signs of disease or injury, how to judge the quality of grazing land, how to manage the books and accounts that kept the operation running. The other ranch hands slowly warmed to her, won over by her willingness to do hard physical labor alongside them and her refusal to ask anyone to do something she would not do herself. She learned their names and their stories. Old Pete, who had been with her father since the beginning, young Tommy, who sent most of his wages back to his widowed mother in Kansas, Miguel, who had come north from Texas looking for better opportunities. But it was Ethan she found herself thinking about at odd moments. Ethan whose opinion mattered most. Ethan who could calm her temper with a well-timed comment or a steady look. She caught herself watching him when she thought he was not looking, noting the way his muscles flexed as he hefted a saddle, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled, the way his voice dropped lower when he was being serious about something. She told herself it was just gratitude, just respect for someone who was helping her achieve her goals. She told herself she was too busy to think about romance, too focused on survival to worry about attraction. She told herself a lot of things that were not quite true. One evening, about a month after her arrival in Snake River, Georgia was going over the account books in her father's study when Ethan knocked on the open door. "Come in," she called, not looking up from the columns of numbers that refused to add up the way she wanted them to. "You are going to ruin your eyes working by lamplight," Ethan said, stepping into the room. "Then I will get spectacles," Georgia said absently, making another notation. "Did you need something?" "Actually, I wanted to talk to you about the Clearwater situation," Ethan said. That got Georgia's attention. She looked up, setting down her pen. "What about it?" "There is a town meeting tomorrow night. The Ranchers Association gathers once a month to discuss common concerns, share information, that sort of thing. Marcus Clearwater will be there. I think you should attend." Georgia felt her pulse quicken. "To confront him about the water rights, to introduce yourself," Ethan said. "To let people know you are serious about running this ranch, and yes, maybe to start a conversation about the water situation. But Georgia, you need to be smart about this. Clearwater has influence in this town. You cannot just storm in and make accusations." "I do not make accusations," Georgia said coolly. "I state facts." Ethan sighed and ran a hand through his hair. "You know what I mean. You need to play the political game a little bit, be diplomatic. Make allies before you make enemies." "I am terrible at diplomacy," Georgia admitted. "I always have been. I say what I think and I do not apologize for it." "I know," Ethan said, and there was something almost affectionate in his tone. "But maybe, just this once, you could try to count to 10 before you speak, for the sake of the ranch." Georgia considered this. She did not like the idea of moderating herself, of playing games and dancing around the truth. But she also knew that Ethan was right. She needed allies if she was going to succeed out here. She could not do everything alone, no matter how much her pride might want her to try. "Fine," she said. "I will attend the meeting, and I will try to be diplomatic, but I am not making any promises beyond that." "I would not expect you to," Ethan said with a small smile. "I will go with you if you want, provide moral support." "You just want to make sure I do not start a fight," Georgia said, but she could not quite keep the smile off her own face. "That too," Ethan agreed cheerfully. The next evening, Georgia dressed carefully in one of her better dresses. A dark green fabric that her mother had insisted was appropriate for a young lady of good breeding. She had always hated the restrictive clothing, the corset that pinched her waist, the layers of petticoats that made simple movement an exercise in coordination. But she understood the value of appearance, especially in a situation where she was already fighting against prejudice. Ethan was waiting for her outside, cleaned up and wearing what she suspected was his only good shirt. He looked at her for a moment, his expression unreadable, then offered his arm with old-fashioned courtesy. "You look nice," he said simply. "I look like I am going to a funeral," Georgia said, but she took his arm anyway. They walked together into town, the evening air cooling rapidly as the sun set behind the mountains. Snake River was not a large town, just a main street with a general store, a saloon, a church, and a handful of other businesses. The meeting was being held in the back room of the saloon, and Georgia could hear the rumble of male voices as they approached. She felt Ethan's arm tense slightly under her hand. "Remember," he murmured. "Diplomatic." "I remember," Georgia said through gritted teeth. They stepped into the room, and conversation died away like someone had slammed a door on it. Every head turned to look at them, and Georgia felt the weight of dozens of male eyes assessing her, judging her, finding her wanting. She lifted her chin and stared back, refusing to show any sign of weakness or uncertainty. A man at the head of the long table stood up slowly. He was in his 50s, with iron-gray hair and cold eyes that reminded Georgia of a snake's. Everything about him spoke of power and the expectation of obedience. "Well," he said, his voice carrying easily across the silent room, "this is unexpected. I heard that Samuel Parker's daughter had come to claim the ranch, but I did not expect to see her at a ranchers' meeting. This is a men's gathering, miss." Georgia felt her temper spike instantly, but she caught Ethan's warning glance and forced herself to speak calmly. "My name is Georgia Parker, and I am now the owner of the Parker Ranch. As such, I believe I have every right to attend a meeting of the local Ranchers Association. Unless you are suggesting that property ownership is restricted by gender, Mr. Clearwater." A few of the other men shifted uncomfortably. Marcus Clearwater's eyes narrowed slightly. "You know who I am." "I make it my business to know the names of my neighbors," Georgia said evenly, "especially neighbors who control access to resources that affect multiple properties in the area." "Resources," Clearwater repeated, and now there was a dangerous edge to his voice. "You mean water?" "I mean the spring in the northern hills," Georgia said. "The spring on unclaimed public land that multiple ranches could benefit from if access was shared fairly." The room erupted into murmurs. Clearwater held up a hand and the noise subsided immediately. "That land has been used by the Clearwater Ranch for 15 years. It is mine by right of use and improvement." "But not by legal title," Georgia said. "I checked with the land office. No one has filed a claim on that territory." "Because everyone around here understands that it belongs to me," Clearwater said, his voice dropping to something cold and threatening. "Your father understood that. He accepted it." "My father is dead," Georgia said bluntly, "and I am not my father. I am fighting for the survival of my ranch, and I will use every legal means at my disposal to ensure that survival. If that means filing a claim on public land, then that is what I will do." The silence that followed was absolute. Georgia could feel Ethan beside her, tense as a drawn bowstring. She knew she had just made a powerful enemy, knew that she had probably handled this in the worst possible way, knew that her temper had once again gotten the better of her judgment. But she also knew that she had spoken the truth, and she refused to back down from it. Clearwater stared at her for a long moment, and Georgia met his gaze without flinching. Finally, he smiled, but it was the smile of a wolf showing its teeth. "You are either very brave or very foolish, Miss Parker. I have not decided which yet. But let me be clear. If you try to file a claim on that land, you will regret it. I have ways of making life very difficult for people who cross me." "Is that a threat?" Georgia asked, her voice sharp. "It is a statement of fact," Clearwater said. "Ask anyone in this room. Ask them what happens to people who get in my way." Georgia looked around the room at the faces of the other ranchers. Some looked sympathetic, some looked afraid, some looked carefully neutral. No one spoke up in her defense. "Then I suppose I will have to be careful not to get in your way," Georgia said coldly. "I will simply proceed along my own path, using the legal rights available to me as a landowner and a citizen. If our paths happen to intersect, well, that will be an interesting problem to solve." She turned and walked out of the room before Clearwater could respond, her back straight and her head high. She heard Ethan's footsteps behind her, and then they were outside in the cool night air, and George's hands were shaking with a combination of anger and delayed fear. "That went well," Ethan said dryly. "Do not start," Georgia said, her voice tight. "I am not starting anything," Ethan said. I am just observing that you managed to make an enemy of the most powerful man in the territory within your first 5 minutes at a social gathering. That might be some kind of record. He was never going to be my friend, Georgia said. At least now we know where we stand. We stand in a very dangerous position, Ethan said seriously. Clearwater was not exaggerating about his ability to make life difficult. He has men who are loyal to him, and some of them are not particular about the methods they use. Georgia stopped walking and turned to face him. Are you saying I should back down? That I should just accept his control over resources that could save my ranch? No, Ethan said. I am saying we need to be smart about how we proceed. We need to file that land claim quickly before Clearwater can beat us to it. We need to make sure we have legal documentation for everything, and we need to be prepared for retaliation. I am not afraid of him, Georgia said. Maybe you should be, Ethan said quietly. Fear is not always a bad thing. It keeps you alive. Georgia looked at him in the dim light from the saloon windows, this patient man who had somehow become essential to her in just a few short weeks. Why are you doing this? She asked abruptly. Why are you helping me? You could walk away right now, find work somewhere safer, somewhere that does not involve getting on the bad side of Marcus Clearwater. Why stay? Ethan was quiet for a moment, his face half in shadow. Because I think you are worth helping, he said finally. Because I believe you can succeed at this if you have the right support. And because I meant what I said that first day. Life with you will never be boring. Something warm unfurled in George's chest, something that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with the way Ethan was looking at her. I am going to file that claim, she said softly, first thing tomorrow morning. I know, Ethan said. And I will be right there with you when you do. They walked back to the ranch together in comfortable silence, and Georgia allowed herself to lean slightly against Ethan's solid presence. For the first time since arriving in Idaho, she felt like maybe she was not entirely alone in this fight. The next morning, true to her word, Georgia rode into town with Ethan and filed a formal claim on the land containing the spring. The clerk at the land office looked nervous when he saw what she was doing, but he could not legally refuse to process the paperwork. By noon, Georgia was the official claimant on 40 acres of prime territory that included the most reliable water source in the region. By sunset, 3 of the fence posts on her eastern boundary had been cut down, and a dozen of her cattle were missing. Georgia stood looking at the damage, her jaw clenched so tight it ached. Pete and Miguel were already out looking for the missing cattle, and Tommy was working on temporary repairs to the fence. Ethan stood beside her, his face grim. It is starting, he said unnecessarily. Let it start, Georgia said. I will not be intimidated. Over the next 2 weeks, the harassment escalated. More fences were cut. A water trough was poisoned, killing 2 horses. Someone started a small fire in the hay barn in the middle of the night, and only quick action by the hands prevented it from spreading. No one ever saw who was responsible, but everyone knew who was behind it. Georgia refused to back down. She filed reports with the town sheriff, a useless exercise since the sheriff was firmly in Clearwater's pocket. She hired 2 additional men to ride night watch on the property. She kept a loaded rifle by her bed and slept lightly, starting awake at every sound. The strain was taking its toll. She could see it in the worried faces of her ranch hands, in the dark circles under Ethan's eyes, in her own reflection when she caught sight of herself in a mirror. But she also felt a fierce pride in the fact that she was still standing, still fighting, still refusing to give up. One evening, she was working in the barn when she heard raised voices from outside. She grabbed the rifle she now kept close at all times and ran out to find Ethan facing down 3 men on horseback. She recognized them as Clearwater's men, recognizable by the distinctive brand on their horses and the arrogant way they sat their saddles. "We are here with a message from Mr. Clearwater," one of them was saying. He was a big man with a scar across his cheek and eyes that held no warmth. "He is willing to buy the Parker Ranch for a fair price. He suggests you take the offer, miss, before something unfortunate happens." "You can tell Mr. Clearwater that my ranch is not for sale," Georgia said, stepping up beside Ethan with the rifle held ready. "And you can tell him that if he wants to threaten me, he should have the courage to do it to my face instead of sending his hired thugs." The scarred man's face darkened. "You have a sharp tongue, lady. Someone should teach you to keep it in your head. Is that another threat?" Georgia asked, her voice deadly calm even as fury burned through her veins. "Because I am keeping track of all these threats. I am documenting every incident of harassment, every act of sabotage, every intimidation attempt. And when I have enough evidence, I am going to take it to the territorial governor himself if I have to. I am an educated woman with connections back east, and I will make enough noise that someone will eventually have to listen." "Big words," the scarred man said. "But words will not protect you out here." "No," Ethan said quietly, "but I will." The two men stared at each other, and Georgia saw something dangerous pass between them, an understanding of potential violence that made her heart race. Then the scarred man spat on the ground and wheeled his horse around. "You have been warned," he said over his shoulder. "What happens next is on you." They rode off, leaving a cloud of dust hanging in the air. Georgia lowered the rifle, her hands trembling slightly with the aftermath of adrenaline. "That was close," she said. "Too close," Ethan agreed. "Georgia, maybe you should consider Clearwater's offer. Just think about it. You could sell, pay off your father's debts, and go back east. Start a new life somewhere safer." Georgia turned to stare at him in disbelief. "Is that what you want?" "For me to give up, I want you to be alive," Ethan said, and there was something raw in his voice. "I want you to be safe, and right now you are neither of those things." "I am not running away," Georgia said stubbornly. "This is my land, my legacy, my responsibility. I will not let Marcus Clearwater bully me into surrendering." "Even if it gets you killed?" Ethan demanded. "Yes," Georgia said simply. "Because if I run now, I will never stop running. I will never be able to look at myself in the mirror and respect what I see. I will never be able to live with the knowledge that I gave up when things got hard." Ethan stared at her for a long moment, and then, suddenly, he was kissing her. It was not a gentle kiss, not a tentative exploration. It was fierce and desperate and full of all the fear and frustration and longing that had been building between them for weeks. Georgia dropped the rifle and kissed him back with equal intensity, her hands fisting in his shirt, her entire world narrowing down to the taste and feel and scent of him. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Ethan rested his forehead against hers. "I cannot lose you," he said hoarsely. "I cannot stand by and watch you throw your life away for a piece of land." "It is not just land," Georgia said. "It is everything. It is proving that I am more than what the world thinks I should be. It is honoring my father's memory. It is building something that matters." She cupped his face in her hands. "But you are right that it is not worth dying for, so we need to find a way to win this fight without getting killed. We need to be smarter than Clearwater, faster than his men, better prepared for whatever comes next." "How?" Ethan asked. George's mind was racing, pieces clicking together like tumblers in a lock. "The law is on our side, but the local law is corrupt, so we go higher. We contact the territorial governor, we document everything. We make this case so public that Clearwater cannot make us disappear without consequences. And in the meantime, we finish the water channel from the spring. We make ourselves self-sufficient so that even if Clearwater tries to cut us off from other resources, we can survive. That is a lot of work, Ethan said, and it will take time we might not have. Then we had better start now, Georgia said. She kissed him again, softer this time, a promise rather than a question. Together. Together, Ethan agreed. Over the next month, they worked with an intensity that bordered on obsession. During the day, Georgia and the ranch hands dug the channel from the spring, backbreaking labor under the hot sun. During the evenings, she wrote letters to politicians, lawyers, and newspaper editors back east, laying out the situation and asking for support. At night, she and Ethan took turns on watch, protecting the property from further sabotage. The harassment from Clearwater's men continued, but it became more cautious, as if they had received orders to intimidate without causing obvious harm. Georgia suspected that her letters were already having an effect. That word was getting around that she was not going to be an easy target. The relationship between Georgia and Ethan deepened during those long, difficult weeks. They stole moments of tenderness in between the crisis and conflict. Quick kisses in the barn, hands held during evening walks, quiet conversations about dreams and fears and hopes for the future. Georgia had never felt this way about anyone, this sense of partnership and passion intertwined, this certainty that she had found someone who truly understood her. "I love you," she told him one night as they sat on the porch watching the stars. The words surprised her, but as soon as she spoke them, she knew they were absolutely true. Ethan turned to look at her, his eyes reflecting the lamplight from inside the house. "I love you too," he said. "I think I have loved you since that first day when you were shooting bottles and looking like you wanted to set the world on fire." "I still want to set the world on fire," Georgia said with a small smile. "I just want to do it with you beside me." "I am not going anywhere," Ethan promised. They kissed as the Idaho wind whispered through the grass, and the cattle lowed softly in the distance, and Georgia felt a peace that had eluded her for most of her life. This was where she belonged, with this man on this land, fighting this fight. The water channel was nearly complete when Marcus Clearwater himself rode onto the Parker ranch, accompanied by a dozen armed men. Georgia saw them coming from her position on the ridge above the spring and felt her stomach drop. This was it, the confrontation she had been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. She rode down to meet them, aware of Ethan and the other hands falling in behind her. They were outnumbered and outgunned, but Georgia kept her head high and her expression calm as she faced down the man who had been trying to destroy her for months. "Mr. Clearwater," she said coolly. "To what do I owe the pleasure of this visit?" Clearwater's face was like carved stone. "I came to see for myself what you have been building. This channel from my spring." "It is not your spring," Georgia said. "I have legal claim to this land, properly filed and documented. You have no more right to it than I do and considerably less legal standing." "Legal standing," Clearwater repeated. "Do you think legal standing matters out here? Do you think a piece of paper from some government office changes reality?" "I think it changes enough," Georgia said. "I think it means that if you interfere with my use of this water source, I can have you arrested for theft and harassment. I think it means that I have written documentation of my rights, and that documentation has been sent to multiple interested parties, including the territorial governor and several newspapers back east. I think it means that if something unfortunate happens to me, people will ask questions and demand answers." Clearwater's eyes narrowed. "You have been busy." "I have been protecting my interests," Georgia said, "just as you have been trying to destroy them. But here is what I am proposing. We end this conflict now before it escalates further. We can both use the spring. The water is plentiful enough to support both our operations. We can draw up a formal agreement, have it witnessed and recorded, and we can both go back to focusing on our ranches instead of fighting each other." "You think I would agree to share what is mine?" Clearwater demanded. "I think you would agree to a reasonable compromise that protects both our interests and keeps you from facing legal consequences for your actions over the past few months," Georgia said. "I have documentation, Mr. Clearwater. I have dates, times, descriptions of your men, records of damages. I have enough to make a very convincing case that you have been engaged in a systematic campaign of harassment and intimidation. Is that really the legacy you want to leave? Is that how you want to be remembered?" She could see the calculation in Clearwater's eyes, the weighing of options and outcomes. He was a bully, but he was not stupid. He understood that the world was changing, that the old ways of simply taking what you wanted were becoming more complicated. "If I agree to this," he said slowly, "if I agree to share access to the spring, what guarantees do I have that you will not try to push me out entirely?" "The same guarantees I have that you will not continue to sabotage my operation," Georgia said. "We put it in writing, we have it witnessed by neutral parties, and we both abide by the terms. It is not trust exactly, but it is accountability, which is sometimes more reliable than trust." Clearwater was silent for a long moment, and Georgia held her breath. Everything hung on this moment, the entire future of the ranch balanced on a knife's edge. Finally, Clearwater nodded once, sharp and decisive. "Fine. We will draw up an agreement. But understand this, Miss Parker, if you cross me, if you violate the terms of our arrangement, I will not be so generous again." "I understand," Georgia said. "And I assure you I have no interest in crossing you. I just want to run my ranch and build a life here. That is all I have ever wanted." They worked out the basic terms right there on horseback, and then rode into town together to have a lawyer draw up the formal documents. By sunset, the agreement was signed, witnessed, and filed with the land office. Georgia and Marcus Clearwater were now, if not friends, at least not actively trying to destroy each other. When Georgia and Ethan finally returned to the ranch that evening, exhausted and emotionally drained, Pete and the other hands greeted them with questions and concerns. Georgia explained what had happened and watched the tension slowly drain out of their faces as they realized the immediate danger was over. "You did it," Tommy said, shaking his head in amazement. "You actually stood up to Marcus Clearwater and won." "We all did it," Georgia corrected. "None of this would have been possible without every single person on this ranch working together. We still have a long way to go to make this operation profitable, but at least now we can focus on ranching instead of defending ourselves." That night, alone in the ranch house with Ethan, Georgia finally allowed herself to feel the full weight of what they had accomplished. She had not just saved the ranch. She had proven to herself and everyone else that she was capable of handling whatever challenges came her way. She had found her strength, her purpose, and the man she wanted to spend her life with. "Marry me," she said suddenly, the words tumbling out before she could second-guess them. Ethan, who had been building up the fire in the hearth, turned to stare at her. "What?" "Marry me," Georgia repeated, standing up from the chair where she had been sitting. "I know it is unconventional for the woman to propose. I know we have only known each other for a few months. I know that by all the rules of proper society, I should wait for you to ask me. But I have never been good at following rules, and I do not want to waste time on things that do not matter. I love you. I want to build a life with you. So marry me." Ethan crossed the room in 3 long strides and pulled her into his arms. "Yes," he said against her hair. "Yes, I will marry you. I would have asked you myself if I thought you would say yes. I did not think I had anything to offer you except hard work and uncertain prospects." You offer me partnership, Georgia said, pulling back to look into his eyes. You offer me respect and patience and love. You offer me yourself, and that is more than enough. They were married 2 weeks later in the small church in Snake River, with the ranch hands as witnesses and half the town in attendance. Georgia wore her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit her taller frame, and Ethan wore a new suit that he purchased specially for the occasion. When the preacher asked if anyone objected to the union, there was only silence, and when he pronounced them husband and wife, Georgia kissed Ethan with all the passion and promise of their future together. The years that followed were not easy. Ranching never was. There were droughts and storms, good years and bad years, cattle lost to disease and markets that fluctuated wildly. But Georgia and Ethan faced it all together, their partnership growing stronger with each challenge they overcame. They finished the water channel and built a thriving operation that became known throughout the territory for its quality cattle and innovative practices. Georgia proved to be a natural businesswoman, with a sharp eye for market trends and a talent for negotiation that served them well. Ethan managed the day-to-day operations with quiet competence, earning the respect and loyalty of every man who worked for them. 2 years after their marriage, Georgia gave birth to a son. They named him Samuel, after her father, and he had Georgia's green eyes and Ethan's patient temperament. Holding her newborn son in her arms, Georgia felt a completeness she had never expected to find, a sense that all the struggles and sacrifices had led to this perfect moment. "He is beautiful," Ethan said softly, looking down at his wife and child with an expression of absolute wonder. "You are beautiful." "I am exhausted," Georgia said with a tired laugh. "But yes, he is perfect, and he is going to grow up knowing that his parents built something worth having, something that will last." Over the next decade, the Parker Ranch flourished. They added more land, expanded their herd, and became one of the most respected operations in Idaho. Georgia and Ethan had 3 more children: a daughter named Rose, who had her mother's temper and her father's calm; twin boys named James and Joseph, who were inseparable and endlessly energetic. The ranch house expanded to accommodate the growing family, with new rooms added and old spaces renovated. Georgia hired a teacher from back east to establish a proper school in Snake River, ensuring that her children and the children of the ranch hands had access to education. She became involved in territorial politics, advocating for women's property rights and better infrastructure for rural communities. Marcus Clearwater, true to his word, abided by the terms of their agreement. He and Georgia never became friends, but they developed a grudging mutual respect. When Clearwater's health began to fail in his later years, it was Georgia who helped negotiate the sale of his ranch to a family from Oregon, ensuring that the transition was fair and legal. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Ethan took Georgia back to the spot where they had first met, where she had been shooting bottles in a fury of grief and frustration. The fence posts had been replaced many times over the years, and the land looked different now, greener and more prosperous. But the mountains in the distance were the same, and the sky stretched vast and blue above them. "You remember what I said to you that day?" Ethan asked, his arm around Georgia's waist. "You said that our life would never be boring," Georgia recalled with a smile. "You were right about that." "I was right about a lot of things," Ethan said with mock arrogance. "I was right that you would succeed at this. I was right that you were worth helping. I was right that I loved you." "I was right too," Georgia said. "I was right that I had a terrible temper, although I've gotten slightly better at controlling it over the years. I was right that I did not belong in Boston, and I was right when I asked you to marry me." "The best decision you ever made," Ethan agreed, kissing her temple. They stood there together, looking out over the land they had fought for and built together, the land that would pass to their children and their children's children. It had not been the life Georgia had expected when she stepped off the train in Snake River all those years ago, angry and grieving and full of desperate determination. It had been so much better. The temper that had once felt like a curse had become fuel for her ambitions, channeled into productive action rather than destructive fury. The patience that Ethan had shown her from the very beginning had taught her that strength could be gentle, that power did not always have to be loud. Together, they had built not just a successful ranch, but a family, a community, and a legacy that would endure. And through all the challenges and triumphs, through the daily struggles and the moments of perfect joy, they had never once been bored. As the sun began to set over the Idaho mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Georgia leaned into her husband's embrace and felt the deep contentment of a life well lived. She had been warned from childhood that her temper would be her downfall, that her inability to conform would limit her possibilities, that a woman like her could never truly succeed in a man's world. She had proven every one of those warnings wrong, not by becoming someone different, but by finding someone who loved her exactly as she was. Ethan had seen her fury and her passion and her stubborn refusal to back down, and instead of trying to change her, he had simply grinned and signed on for the adventure. Their life together had been many things: challenging, rewarding, frustrating, joyful, exhausting, exhilarating. But it had never, not for a single moment, been boring. And as they walked back to the ranch house hand in hand, ready to return to their children and their responsibilities, and the life they had built together, Georgia knew with absolute certainty that she would not change a single thing about the journey that had brought them here. The years continued to roll by like the seasons, each bringing its own particular challenges and joys. Samuel grew into a serious young man who loved working with the cattle, while Rose developed her mother's head for business and her father's way with horses. The twins, James and Joseph, were the ranch's unofficial morale boosters, always ready with a joke or a prank to lighten the mood during difficult times. Georgia found herself thinking often about her younger self, that angry 20-year-old who had arrived in Idaho with nothing but grief and determination. If she could go back and tell that girl what the future held, she would not believe it. The happiness, the success, the love that had filled her life seemed impossible from that vantage point of loss and uncertainty. But looking back now, Georgia could see the thread that connected that girl to the woman she had become. The temper was still there, though more controlled. The refusal to accept limitations was still there, though more strategically deployed. The fire that had once threatened to consume her had instead become a beacon, guiding her through the darkness toward something better. On a crisp autumn morning in 1897, 15 years after her arrival in Snake River, Georgia stood on the porch of the ranch house watching her children play in the yard. Samuel was teaching Rose how to rope a practice target, while the twins chased each other around with wooden swords, their laughter carrying on the wind. Ethan came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, resting his chin on her shoulder. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "Everything," Georgia said. "The past, the present, the future, how lucky we have been." "Luck had nothing to do with it," Ethan said. "You made this happen through sheer force of will and hard work." "We made this happen," Georgia corrected. "I could never have done it without you. You were my anchor when the storms came, my partner when I needed someone to share the load, my love when I needed reminding that there was more to life than just survival." "You were all those things for me too," Ethan said quietly. "You still are. Every single day, I wake up and feel grateful that you walked into my life. Every single day, I love you more than I did the day before." Georgia turned in his arms to face him, this man who had become the center of her world. The sandy brown hair was now touched with gray at the temples, and there were lines at the corners of his eyes from years of squinting into the sun. But the blue eyes were the same, still patient, still filled with the steady love that had never wavered. "I was afraid when I first came here," she admitted. "I was afraid that I would fail, that I was not strong enough or smart enough or tough enough to make it in this world. But you believed in me even when I did not believe in myself. You saw something in me that I could not see." "I saw a woman who was already strong and smart and tough," Ethan said. "I just helped her see it too." They kissed as they had kissed 1,000 times before, the familiarity of it comforting and exciting all at once. This was the partnership Georgia had never known she needed, the love she had never allowed herself to hope for, the life she had built through equal parts stubbornness and surrender. That evening, the entire family gathered for dinner, a raucous affair with everyone talking over each other and reaching for dishes and sharing stories from their day. Georgia sat at the head of the table, her father's place, and looked around at the faces of the people she loved most in the world. Samuel was describing a problem with one of the heifers, his young face serious and thoughtful. Rose was arguing with him about the best solution, her quick mind already working through possibilities. The twins were making each other laugh with increasingly silly jokes. And Ethan sat at the other end of the table, his eyes meeting hers across the chaos and noise, sharing a moment of perfect understanding. This was what she had fought for. Not just the ranch, not just the land, not just the financial security. This family, this love, this sense of belonging and purpose and home. This was the prize at the end of all the struggle. Later, after the children were in bed and the house had settled into nighttime quiet, Georgia and Ethan sat together in the study going over the accounts. It was a familiar ritual, one they had performed countless times over the years. The numbers told a story of steady growth and careful management, of risks taken and rewards earned. "We did well this year," Ethan observed, making a notation in the ledger. "Even with the dry spell in August, we came out ahead." "We always do," Georgia said with satisfaction, "because we plan carefully and work hard and do not give up when things get difficult." "That is my wife," Ethan said with a smile, "the eternal optimist." "I am a realist," Georgia corrected. "I see things as they are, not as I wish they were. But I also see things as they could be, and I work to make that potential into reality." "Which is why you succeed at everything you attempt," Ethan said. Georgia was quiet for a moment, thinking about all the ways she had failed over the years, all the mistakes and missteps and moments of doubt. "Not everything," she said finally, "but enough. I have succeeded at enough to feel proud of what we have built." They finished the accounts and went upstairs to their bedroom, the room they had shared for 15 years of marriage. It was a comfortable space, worn in by use and affection, filled with the accumulated debris of their shared life. Georgia prepared for bed with the ease of long habit, and when she slipped under the covers next to Ethan, she felt the same sense of rightness she had felt every night since their wedding. "I love you," she said into the darkness. "I love you too," Ethan replied, pulling her close. "Always." Georgia drifted off to sleep feeling safe and cherished and completely at peace with the life she had chosen. Her temper still flared sometimes, when faced with injustice or stupidity or cruelty. But it no longer controlled her. She controlled it, wielding it like a tool when necessary and setting it aside when it was not. The ranch continued to prosper over the following years. Samuel took over more and more of the daily operations as he grew into adulthood, proving himself to be a capable and innovative manager. Rose surprised everyone by developing an interest in veterinary medicine after helping the local doctor treat an injured horse. And Georgia supported her daughter's ambitions, even when others questioned the propriety of a young woman pursuing such a profession. The twins eventually stopped being quite so inseparable as they developed their own distinct interests and personalities. James became fascinated with engineering and talked about going to college to study irrigation systems and infrastructure development. Joseph wanted to be a lawyer, inspired by his mother's stories about fighting for legal rights and protecting the vulnerable. Georgia watched her children grow and change with a mixture of pride and nostalgia. They were becoming their own people, independent and confident and ready to make their mark on the world. She had given them the tools they needed: education, opportunity, and the unwavering belief that they could achieve anything they set their minds to. On George's 40th birthday, the entire community of Snake River gathered at the Parker Ranch for a celebration. The house and yard were filled with people, friends and neighbors and business associates, all of them there to honor the woman who had transformed not just her own ranch but the entire region. Georgia had become a force in territorial politics, using her influence to advocate for better schools, improved roads, and legal protections for women and children. She had helped establish a lending cooperative that allowed small ranchers to access capital without falling prey to predatory lenders. She had mentored dozens of young women, encouraging them to pursue their ambitions and fight for their rights. As she stood on the porch looking out at the crowd, Ethan came up beside her. "You have accomplished a lot in 20 years," he said. "Your father would be proud." "I hope so," Georgia said. "I hope he is somewhere watching and knowing that his ranch not only survived but thrived. That his daughter found her place in this world and made it better for being here." "I know so," Ethan said firmly. "Just as I know that your mother would be proud too, even if she never understood your choices. You proved that a woman could have strength and independence and still find love and family. I proved that a woman could have a terrible temper and still build a good life," Georgia said with a wry smile. "As long as she found a patient man willing to grin and say that life would never be boring." "And it has not been," Ethan said, kissing her cheek. "Not for a single day." The party went on late into the night, with music and dancing and far too much food. Georgia danced with each of her children, with old friends, with ranch hands past and present. But her favorite dance of the night was the one she shared with Ethan as the stars wheeled overhead and the moon cast silver light across the land they had built together. "Thank you," she said as they swayed to the music, "for everything, for believing in me, for loving me, for staying." "Where else would I go?" Ethan asked with genuine confusion. "You are my home, Georgia. You always have been." And in that moment, with her husband's arms around her and her children nearby and her land stretching out in all directions, Georgia understood that she had achieved something most people never found. She had built a legacy that would endure, created a family that would carry on her values, and found a love that would sustain her through whatever years remained. The terrible temper that had once been her greatest liability had become her greatest strength, the fuel that powered her refusal to accept limitations or injustice. And the patient cowboy who had grinned at her warning had become the foundation upon which she had built everything that mattered. Their life together had indeed never been boring. It had been extraordinary, challenging, rewarding, and filled with more love than Georgia had ever thought possible. And as they danced under the stars on her 40th birthday, surrounded by everyone they loved, Georgia knew with absolute certainty that she would do it all again in a heartbeat. The years continued their relentless march forward, bringing change and challenge and growth. Idaho achieved statehood in 1890, and Georgia was invited to the celebration in Boise, recognition of her contributions to the territory's development. She and Ethan made the journey with their children, and Samuel got his first glimpse of real city life, complete with electric lights and paved streets. But no matter how much the outside world changed, the Parker Ranch remained a constant, a testament to what could be accomplished through hard work and determination and love. The water channel they had fought so hard for continued to flow, sustaining not just their cattle, but those of their neighbors as well. The agreements Georgia had negotiated created a framework for cooperation that benefited the entire region. Rose did indeed become a veterinarian, one of the first women in the state to achieve that distinction. She practiced throughout the Snake River Valley, earning respect for her skill and dedication. Samuel married a woman from a neighboring ranch and brought her home to live, and soon the ranch house echoed with the voices of a new generation of children. The twins both left for college, James to study engineering and Joseph to study law, but they returned often, bringing fresh ideas and new perspectives that helped the ranch continue to evolve and adapt. Georgia encouraged their ambitions, knowing that the world they would inherit was different from the one she had conquered, requiring different skills and different strategies. As Georgia entered her 50s, she began to think more seriously about the future, about succession and legacy, and ensuring that everything she and Ethan had built would continue after they were gone. She worked with Joseph to establish the ranch as a legal trust, with clear guidelines for management and ownership that would prevent family disputes and protect the operation for generations to come. She also began writing down her story, not for publication but for her grandchildren and their children after them. She wanted them to know where they came from, what struggles had been overcome, what battles had been fought and won. She wrote about her terrible temper and how she had learned to channel it into productive action. She wrote about Ethan's patience and how it had saved her from herself. She wrote about the land and the water and the cattle and all the small details that made up the daily reality of ranching life. Most of all, she wrote about love. The love between husband and wife, parent and child, community and individual. The love that made hard work bearable and good times joyful. The love that was, in the end, the only thing that truly mattered. One evening, as Georgia sat at her father's old desk writing in her journal, Ethan came in carrying 2 cups of coffee. He set one down beside her and settled into the chair across the desk, content to simply be in her presence while she worked. "What are you writing about today?" he asked. "About the day we met," Georgia said, looking up with a soft smile. "About how you were not intimidated by my anger or my warnings. About how you grinned and said that our life would never be boring." "I was right," Ethan said complacently. "You were," Georgia agreed. "Although I am not sure you fully understood what you were signing up for at the time." "I understood enough," Ethan said. "I understood that you were exactly the kind of woman I had been looking for my whole life, even if I did not know it until I found you. I understood that you were worth any amount of trouble or hardship or uncertainty, and I understood that boring was the last thing I wanted my life to be." Georgia set down her pen and reached across the desk to take his hand. "We have had a good life together, haven't we?" "The best," Ethan confirmed. "And we are not done yet. We have years ahead of us still, years to watch our grandchildren grow, years to continue building and improving and making our mark on this world." He was right about that too. They had many years left, years filled with the same mixture of challenge and joy that had characterized their entire marriage. They saw their grandchildren born and grow, passed on their knowledge and experience to the next generation, and continued to be vital forces in their community. On their 30th wedding anniversary, the entire family gathered at the ranch for a celebration that rivaled Georgia's 40th birthday party. The house was full to bursting with children and grandchildren, in-laws and friends, business associates and political allies. Georgia stood on the porch where she had stood so many times before, looking out at the evidence of everything she and Ethan had created. 30 years, she said wonderingly. It seems like no time at all and also like forever. I know what you mean, Ethan said, standing beside her with his arm around her waist. Every day has been an adventure, but they have also built on each other into something solid and enduring. I love you, Georgia said, turning to face him. I have loved you for 30 years, and I will love you for 30 more if we are blessed with that much time. And I love you, Ethan said. My fierce, stubborn, brilliant wife. You are the best thing that ever happened to me. They kissed as their family and friends applauded, and Georgia felt the same rush of emotion she had felt on their wedding day. This was the man who had stood by her through everything, who had never wavered in his support or his love, who had helped her become the best version of herself. As the celebration continued around them, Georgia reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. She had arrived in Idaho as a grief-stricken young woman with nothing but a failing ranch and a terrible temper. She was leaving this life as a respected community leader, successful rancher, beloved wife and mother and grandmother, and a woman who had made a genuine difference in her corner of the world. The temper was still there, though mellowed by age and experience. She still got angry at injustice and cruelty and stupidity. But she had learned to use that anger constructively, to channel it into action rather than destruction. And she had Ethan, always patient, always steady, always ready with a calm word or a steady hand when she needed grounding. The ranch continued to thrive into the new century. As automobiles began to replace horses and electricity came to even rural areas, the Parker Ranch adapted and evolved. Samuel proved to be an innovative manager, introducing new breeding techniques and business practices that kept the operation competitive. Rose's expertise as a veterinarian became increasingly valuable as animal husbandry became more scientific. The twins contributed their own skills, James designing irrigation systems that improved productivity, Joseph handling the increasingly complex legal and regulatory environment. Georgia and Ethan gradually stepped back from daily management, content to serve as advisors and mentors, while the younger generation took over. But they remained active and engaged, still rising early each morning, still walking the land together, still discussing strategies and solutions over coffee in the study. In 1915, on a clear autumn day much like the one when Georgia had first arrived in Idaho, she and Ethan rode out to the spring that had been the source of so much conflict all those years ago. The water channel they had built was still functioning perfectly, still providing life to the land and the cattle that depended on it. They dismounted and stood together at the edge of the spring, listening to the gentle sound of water flowing over stone. Georgia was 65 years old now, her red hair faded to gray, her face lined by years of sun and wind and living. But her green eyes were still bright, still fierce, still filled with the fire that had defined her entire life. You remember fighting for this? She asked Ethan, who at 67 was moving a bit slower but still steady and strong. I remember everything, Ethan said. Every battle, every victory, every moment of doubt and triumph. I remember thinking that you were going to get us both killed with your stubbornness, and I remember realizing that I did not care because being with you was worth any risk. We won, Georgia said with satisfaction. Not just this fight, but all of them. We built something that will last long after we are gone." "We did," Ethan agreed. "And we did it together, which makes it all the more meaningful." They stood there for a long time, hand in hand, watching the water flow and feeling the breeze on their faces. This land had tested them, challenged them, demanded everything they had to give. And they had risen to meet every challenge, every obstacle, every moment of crisis. As the sun began to sink toward the horizon, painting the sky in familiar shades of gold and crimson, Georgia leaned against her husband and felt profound gratitude for the life they had shared. It had not been easy. It had not been safe or certain or predictable. But it had been theirs, built by their own hands and hearts, shaped by their choices and their love. "I would do it all again," she said softly. "Every difficult moment, every fight, every sleepless night worrying about money or cattle or children. I would do it all again just to end up right here, right now with you." "Me too," Ethan said, kissing the top of her head, although maybe with slightly less drama and a bit more sleep. Georgia laughed, the sound carrying across the quiet land. "Where would be the fun in that? You said yourself that life with me would never be boring." "And I have never regretted those words," Ethan said. "Not once, not ever." They rode back to the ranch as the stars began to appear overhead, comfortable in the silence that came from decades of companionship. The house was warm and welcoming when they arrived, filled with the sounds and smells of family gathered for the evening meal. Georgia paused in the doorway, taking in the scene before her. Samuel and his wife discussing ranch business at one end of the table. Rose arguing cheerfully with her brothers about politics. Grandchildren running underfoot, full of energy and noise and life. This was the legacy she would leave behind, not just land and cattle and buildings, but people, family, love passed down through generations. "Thank you," she said to Ethan, taking his hand one more time, "for everything. For seeing me when I was lost, for loving me when I was difficult, for staying when things got hard, for being exactly the partner I needed even when I did not know I needed one." "The pleasure was all mine," Ethan said with the grin that had captured her heart 3 decades earlier. "After all, life with you has never been boring." And as they stepped into the warmth and light and love of their family home, Georgia knew with absolute certainty that they had achieved something rare and precious. They had built a life worth living, a legacy worth leaving, and a love worth celebrating. Her terrible temper had found its match in his patient strength, and together they had created something beautiful that would endure long after they were gone. The years continued onward, as they always do. Georgia and Ethan celebrated 40 years of marriage, then 45. They welcomed great-grandchildren into the world and watched their family tree expand in directions they had never imagined. The ranch continued to prosper under Samuel's management, and the Parker name became synonymous with quality cattle and ethical business practices throughout the region. When Georgia passed away peacefully in her sleep at the age of 78, the entire state of Idaho mourned. Newspaper obituaries celebrated her contributions to women's rights, agricultural innovation, and community development. But for those who knew her best, the loss was more personal and profound. She had been a force of nature, a woman who refused to accept limitations and who had transformed her corner of the world through sheer determination and love. Ethan stood at her graveside, his own health failing now, and remembered the fierce young woman who had warned him about her terrible temper all those years ago. He remembered grinning and telling her that life would never be boring. He had been right about that. Life with Georgia had been many things, but never, not for a single moment, boring. He joined her 6 months later, and they were buried side by side on a hill overlooking the ranch they had built together. Their graves were marked by simple headstones that bore their names, their dates, and a single shared inscription chosen by their children. They built a life worth living and a love worth remembering. The Parker Ranch continued for generations after they were gone, a living testament to what two determined people could accomplish when they refused to give up and refused to surrender to the limitations others tried to impose on them. The water still flowed from the spring they had fought for, nourishing land and cattle and dreams. The house still stood solid and welcoming, filled with the laughter and tears and daily dramas of family life. And sometimes, on clear autumn evenings when the light was just right and the wind whispered through the grass, ranch hands swore they could see two figures standing on the ridge, hand in hand, watching over the land they had loved so well. Whether ghost or memory, or simply the power of a story well told, the legend of Georgia and Ethan Brooks endured, a reminder that love and determination could overcome any obstacle, and that a terrible temper matched with patient strength could build something extraordinary that would stand the test of time.